time for pain!
Reyn. You know him, you love him, it's his time all the time. Everyone knows the memes, and everyone thinks he's a great character for them, but I've never really seen people discuss his character as, well, a character. So this time I kinda want to go over a bit of a subtle character arc he has, as well as talk about a few of his interactions that paint a different picture than you'd get of him at first glance. Yeah, he is kind of a dumb musclehead with all the funny one-liners, but he's also a fairly empathetic and considerate person who just happens to get people a lot better than, say, Shulk does. And it's cool because, yeah, Shulk gets the whole machines and book smarts and that kind of thing. Reyn isn't good at that stuff, but he's the muscle, and he's also kind of the heart in a way. So it just shows that while they're different personality-wise, Shulk and Reyn do complement each other very well, and you can see why they would be such close friends. This video will contain spoilers up through the events at the Maineth Shrine, but I will be going in plot order, so if you don't want to be spoiled of some future event, you could just hop off at whatever point you've actually gotten to. It is also worth noting, if you're keeping in track with my Monado Monday streams, that I will be going slightly further than the streams themselves have gotten, so if you don't want to be spoiled at like the first 20 minutes of the next stream, don't watch the end of this video. It's actually worth noting that this is my first Xenoblade 1 dedicated video. I've talked about the game before, but I've also talked about X2 or both of them in the same video, so it's really funny to me that the first Xenoblade 1 exclusive topic I'm talking about is the legend himself. So, let's start by talking about Reyn's backstory, or just who he generally is as a person. The Monado Secret Files artbook confirms the canonical ages of all the party members, and from that we learn that the Colony 9 trio of Shulk, Reyn, and Fiora are all 19 years old at the start of the game. This makes sense because while Reyn is a member of the Colony 9 Defense Force, he did not fight at the Battle of Sword Valley a year ago, which makes sense because he would have just turned 18 and probably just joined the Force. It's also known that his parents are dead from a Mechon attack at some point in the past. This doesn't necessarily mean that they died in the war a year ago, because it's also known that Dunban and Fiora's parents died from Mechon when Fiora was fairly young, so it was Dunban who raised her for most of her life. The Mechon were a constant threat, basically as far as the Homs of Colony 9 remember. It just wasn't until about a year ago that a lot of colonies started getting destroyed, and it turned into a full-on war. So, because of that, it's not known exactly who raised Reyn, but he did want to join the Defense Force, and judging by his personality, it seems fairly likely that he wanted to do so in order to fight the Mechon and avenge people he loved who he lost. Reyn spent most of his childhood growing up with Shulk and Fiora, and he and Fiora kind of didn't hit it off as well as Shulk did with either of them. This persists into the present day when he's pretty insecure, surprisingly enough, that Fiora either doesn't like him or doesn't trust him, despite the fact that, well, they've known each other for so long. This is actually your first hint that Reyn might be a bit more sensitive and a bit more empathetic than you would originally think. Of course, Fiora does have some reason to be skeptical of them because Reyn was always the impulsive and hot-headed one of the group that was the most prone to getting everyone else into trouble. Of course, since he and Shulk were so close, that meant that Fiora's beloved Shulk would also get dragged into things a lot of the time, and, you know, she knows he's fragile and doesn't want that. Despite that, though, Reyn is still a good friend to Shulk. Of course, they talk a lot, they hang out, they're good friends in that sense, but he is also aware of the fact that Shulk is nowhere near as physically strong as Reyn or possibly even Fiora is. And because of that, it seems that that's where he developed his weapon choice and his fighting style. He uses the Gun Lancer, however you want to call it. It's called Drivers, Garters. There are a bunch of different things that weapon type actually goes under, but most of all, his fighting style and the weapon he uses are designed to take the aggro from enemies and soak up the damage so his other party members don't have to deal with that. He developed his fighting style around protecting Shulk, so Shulk can do his smartest sneaky thing to get around behind the enemy and backslash them into oblivion, but Reyn is the one feeling pain, so his friend doesn't have to. The first cutscene you actually see Reyn in is right before your first tutorial battle where you're controlling Shulk, And in that, it's not Shulk, the smart one, who's shouting out the orders. It's actually Reyn who's telling Shulk what to do. Now yeah, that makes sense, Reyn is the career soldier who should know that kind of stuff, but it is worth noting that much later on in the game, Shulk knows what starvation tactics are, but Reyn doesn't and requires Dunban to explain it to him. You might think that's really contradictory that the soldier doesn't know battle tactics but the weapons researcher does, but it does make a lot of sense if you think about it. Shulk is very bookish. He reads stuff and probably not only about weapons development, despite that being his forte. Dunban, judging by the equipment he starts out with, having general in the name, might actually be a very high-ranking member of the Colony 9 Defense Force, and Reyn is just a rank-and-file soldier whose job it is to fight on the front lines. He's only been in the Force for maybe a year tops, and he still reports to Colonel Vanguard, so clearly he can't be too high up on the totem pole. Despite that though, his knowledge is in, again, the front line fighting. Reyn's job is to be the crowd control tank. He's better at fighting against large hordes of enemies by soaking up damage and drawing aggro from all of them, so that the other party members can do their thing unimpeded. And that makes sense. His job is to be the guy who gets in there and is the one who engages the enemy to begin with, basically. So he should know a lot about minute-to-minute, one-on-one, or small group battle tactics, but he has no need to know about things like starvation tactics or things you'd use in an all-out war. He's good at the moment-to-moment individual engagements, but he has no need to, well, actually know about things that would require moving whole armies and that kind of thing, so it is consistent with the stuff he actually knows. Moving on a little further in the story, we do get his insecurities about Fiora, but later on, once you get to the attack on Colony 9, Fiora tells him to take care of Shulk, and you get the first little character moment with him where, oh wow, she does trust me, and he's really happy about that. I'm pretty sure he's been worried for a long time that Fiora not trusting him might screw around with their little dynamic, and yeah, he knows Shulk and Fiora are probably going to end up together, so he doesn't want the good thing they have going to get destroyed by one little bit of mistrust between two of the three of them. And it's a good moment to him that kind of perks up his spirits in the middle of the huge attack on Colony 9 to actually hear that. Now, unfortunately, then Fiora kind of dies, so that's a bit of a big deal, and you see the first side of his anger. Now, this is something that does come up a few places, and surprisingly for who he isn't as violent as, well, even Shulk. Shulk is the one who gets violently angry. Reyn, well, yeah, he has a declaration of wanting to destroy all Mechon just as Shulk does. He's a bit calmer in it, surprisingly enough. So that's a bit of a dichotomy there, too. When it comes to revenge, Reyn is actually the slower, calmer, and more calculated one, while Shulk is actually the one who gets all fired up. So it's kind of interesting because in other situations, Reyn's the impulsive one, but it's actually his job as part of his duty to protect Shulk that he put on himself to kind of calm Shulk down and get him to think more rationally. For a decently long part of the story, Reyn is trying to get Shulk to open up about not only his visions, but just his problems and concerns in general. This makes sense. Reyn wants to support him. He's starting to realize that now that Shulk has the power of the Monado, he doesn't need a protector as much as a supporter or someone who's got his back. That is kind of his ongoing overarching character thing, and I'll talk about that more later, but in the short term, he's worried that Shulk not telling people about his visions might pose more harm than good, especially after a vision of Reyn dying was only prevented by Shulk randomly unlocking a new power of the Monado. Along this time, he also runs into Sharla and learns of her plight with her fiancé Gado having died. This is his romantic subplot, basically, but it doesn't start off the way you'd expect it. Especially because Reyn does act like Gado. We know that from flashbacks of him and some things he did. He's got the whole angry revenge thing and certain philosophies that only a soldier would really have. Despite that though, Reyn doesn't immediately jump on it. He does have to warm up to her over time. And initially in the Ether Mines, he's annoyed that Sharla is putting so much on him that he kinda just goes out and says it. He realizes that Sharla is just using him as a replacement for Gado because he's currently gone, and just because he happened to talk to Juju the same way and kind of acts in some of the same manners. That is something that not everyone would necessarily notice, especially a horny 19-year-old like Reyn, like, oh, this woman with the big anime titty is coming on to me slightly and talking about me in the same vein as her deceased fiancé. He's smart enough to not take that as a, oh, this is good, and run for it. He realizes that it's part of a mental thing that she hasn't worked through yet. She has not fully processed the loss of Gado, and, well, this comes back into play a bit later on. Beyond the fact that he gets to live his dream of fighting alongside his hero Dunban, and the fact that they do work together pretty well in cutscenes based on them probably having the same training at some point, nothing really significant happens until we get to Frontier Village and meet Riki. Initially, Reyn is very apprehensive about even the idea of a Nopon hero, and from our perspective as the player, that does make sense based on the Nopon we've met so far, but in-universe, you can see that he is actually kind of prejudiced against the Nopon, and he just doesn't take them seriously in general. And hey, that's a legitimate character flaw that's not really shown off beyond that one scene, but you can obviously tell he gets over it based on the friendship he forms with Riki. Initially, he does tend to mock him for his speech pattern and a few other things he says and does, but later on, you catch him using the word Dino Beast, talking about a Telethia because Riki said it. He doesn't try to correct him, he doesn't even say Telethia. When Riki says Dino Beast and points to it, Reyn just says, a Dino Beast, where? He doesn't even question anything, and that is a very good piece of subtle development that, well, I only picked up on this playthrough, which was at least my fourth, so that goes to show something at the very least. In the High Entia tomb, we've got the oh-so-great button scene that's basically a reason for us to actually have a dungeon there, but you might think that that's a very out-of-character dumb thing for him to do. Despite that though, remember back to the beginning of the game. The Monado is probably the biggest red don't touch this sign in the world, and Reyn still went and touched it just kind of because he wanted to see what would happen. In that context, him pressing a button when it's the only moving part in what appeared to be a sealed room makes so much more sense if you think about it that way. It was still obviously a dumb thing to do, but it is within his impulsive nature to actually do that. After the events on Prison Island, Reyn is obviously happy to see that Fiora's alive, just probably not as much as her brother and the guy who had a crush on her. That being said though, he just had gotten over his fears about her when she had died, so he's probably a lot happier than he lets on, like beyond just, oh, a close friend of mine isn't dead, that's a good thing. He's also relieved that he might get to interact with her in a situation where he's not as concerned about what she thinks of him, where he doesn't have to worry about that kind of thing. He could just be himself and their friendship could go back to probably the way it was in their younger days. But after that, and even after she rejoins the party, there's not really too much big going on with Reyn until we get to the whole Jadeface arc. This is important not only because Jadeface happens to be Gado himself, but also because this is a Sharla-centric arc that serves to further their relationship, especially because at this point in the story, Reyn seems to have shifted a bit of his instinct to protect from Shulk over to her, and probably by extension Juju. Despite having never met him before, Reyn seems to get Gado more than anyone else in the party, and that makes sense based on the amount they've been compared to each other. He's also one of the first to realize that Gado is, despite being controlled, not able to actually hurt Sharla despite having no problem with wiping everyone else out. Despite that though, he's still also smart enough to realize that Sharla just kind of standing there and trying to talk him down isn't going to work either, so he has that balance too. He understands both Gado and realizes that Sharla's not going to stop, so he has to actually restrain her. After the second fight against him in Agniratha, Fiora is able to free Gado from Egil's control, and he and Reyn are able to interact as their true selves for the first time. This is a very short interaction obviously, because the party's about to run off to do something even more important, but you can see that they have a bit of a fast connection and would most likely be friends if they got the opportunity to talk more often. It's also worth noting that Gado puts Sharla's safety in Reyn's hands, not the wielder of the Monado, not the hero of the Homs, Not Fiora, who was the one who actually freed him, but Reyn. Probably because he saw himself in him and not necessarily because he could see that they might have a thing, but just in general because he knows the kind of support Sharla needs. They got close together enough to be engaged. He knows exactly what Sharla needs to function properly, and he sees that Reyn has the potential to do that. Gado is older and smarter than Reyn, and the fact that he sees that potential in him, couple that with the fact that Dunban actually sees a younger him and Reyn, and look at how well Dunban turned out. Clearly, all of Reyn's elders in the military see a huge amount of potential in him, and I wouldn't be surprised if he lived up to that in a different situation where the whole fight against Mechonis didn't happen. An even more important moment comes after that Egil fight, right when the party is escaping Agniratha. Sharla is frantically looking around trying to find him because he wasn't where they'd left him when they went to fight Egil. Reyn again is the one to snap her out of this. He puts his trust in a man he'd barely met, based only by his soldier's instinct and the training that Gado must have also received at some point, to know that he would have found his own way out. And that's true because it is Gado who ultimately saves their lives from the destruction of the city. Unfortunately, his life was spent in that attempt, and despite the fact that the party all got out safely, Gado was fully gone, despite the fact that the Machina doctors may have been able to save him if he wasn't destroyed in that blast. It was at this moment when the torch was truly passed, and this moment where basically Gado gave Reyn and Sharla his blessing. A bit later on, Sharla resolves herself to not let Gado's sacrifice go in vain, and around that same time, I think in the same cutscene, Reyn also utters a declaration that he'll kill Egil. Obviously, it's because other things were going on at the time, and the united force of Bionis was in trouble as well, but I'm pretty sure that Reyn's declaration there, like how he had one for Fiora dying, was more because of Gado's loss than even the loss of all his friends on the Mechonis sword. And that just goes to show the person he is. He might be impulsive, he might not be that book smart, but he is always there for people. He supports them, and he puts his trust in his friends and in the people they trust to ensure that they'll lead the world to the better future he knows they deserve. Reyn and Dunban have a heart-to-heart that I also don't have footage for like some of the later cutscenes, but they're talking about how they're able to support Shulk. And this is basically where Reyn's development of going from Shulk's supporter to his right hand comes to a head. Reyn eventually sees himself as Shulk's shield, while Dunban is his noble steed, or something like that. I don't know. Dahams ride ponios, that's never shown anywhere, because all the technology they have is like actual vehicles, so they don't need to ride animals. That's a question for another day. But I think this works very well. Except he's not Shulk's shield. He's the shield for the entire party. He's the person who keeps everyone strong, and eventually keeps everyone united. In some situations, like Melia and Riki at the beginning, it's because of their dislike for him that they end up still interacting with everyone. But for the most part, everyone is on good terms with him once the full party gets together. And Reyn is really the glue. He doesn't do too much plot-wise outside of the situations I talked about, and isn't as significant as Shulk, Fiora, Dunban, or even Melia, but if it wasn't for him, and it wasn't for his specific brand of smarts that only he could really do well, I think the game would have turned out very differently. And that will do it for this video. This was kind of put together in a very haphazard way because I didn't have time to do it the way I wanted to, but I hope it still turned out well. So, as always, like, comment, and subscribe, do that kind of thing. The algorithm's still trying to kill my channel, so share it too if you want. And yeah, I'm still not sure when I'm going to be able to make a lot of Xenoblade 1 specific videos because I need spoiler cutscenes for that, and we're not on Mondays, it's still going to take a while to get there. But besides that, thank you all for watching, and until next time, this is Luxin, signing off.